Hey everyone, today's story is about a boy who gets reincarnated into an Otome game, only to realize he's the childhood friend of the girl destined to become the terrifying final boss. To avoid a tragic end, he trains to become the strongest, but the more he changes the story, the more the villainess starts looking at him in a very dangerous way. And so the story begins. A large castle with several floors, made of white stone. Columns, a beautiful roof, tall windows, a rich appearance. A guy named Arx knocks on the door and calls out to Mrs. Eleanor. He asks her permission to enter. Fear is visible in the guy's eyes. Lady Eleanor lets him in and immediately asks where he has been. The guy stands silently, his eyes downcast but calm. Arx is a former office slave who has been reborn as a minor character in an Otome game. And for some reason, the Yandere villainess adores him. The action takes place in the kingdom of Celestia, an Otome game that became a hit in Japan thanks to its wild number of endings. Among all the characters, Eleanor stood out for her extreme cruelty. And here he is, Arx Leaford, whose name is not even mentioned in the credits. In other words, Arx was just a decoration, always walking among a crowd of other people, as if invisible, alone. But the guy didn't care about that. Since he was in the game world, according to the laws of the genre, he was obliged to become overpowered, using knowledge from his past life. But Arx remembers almost nothing about who he was before. He only remembers that he lived in a country called Japan and something about this game. And for some reason, he was into Yandere. And for some reason, he was strong. For some reason, he was cool. Now Arx has no one in this world. The guy lives in a shelter where he was taken in and just enjoys his freedom. Arx wonders why he was reborn in the first place. In his opinion, if he were the main character, he would have already cast all the epic magic, or he would have had school romances with the heroines. Suddenly, Arx's train of thought was interrupted by a sudden realization. He clenched his fist and understood. Maybe his moment of glory is still ahead of him, even if he is a useless mob right now. In any case, Arx would take everything from this life for now. And he plunged into memories that had happened earlier. A small village appeared with many small village houses. Arx screams, slashing his wooden sword at his enemy. He jumps viciously in the air. He demonstrates his strength. The enemy falls rapidly to the ground, struck down. The duel was over, and Arx was declared the winner. The boy stood there, his eyes resembling those of small child or puppy. There was a great deal of hope and naivety in them. He smiled very gently. On the ground lay the defeated opponent, a boy the same age as Arx, dressed in a school uniform. He was the boy's friend and said he was giving up. He was pleasantly surprised by Arx's strength. A large crowd watched the spectacle. People shouted that it was a cool fight, that Arx was able to beat all the grown men in the village. The spectators cheered with delight, applauded, and shouted. Arx helped his defeated partner get up from the ground. Suddenly, a little boy who looked like him ran up to him. He was genuinely happy about the victory and praised the boy. The boy asked if he would become like Arx if he trained. He was told that he definitely would, of course. Arx thinks he can't tell them that he started fighting out of boredom because there is no internet or game consoles in this village. As a result, he can defeat anyone in the village, but the path to knighthood is closed to him. His ceiling is hunting small monsters in the area. And then Arx was called over by a man dressed in a strict uniform, but with good intentions. He approached and congratulated the young man on his victory. It was the village elder. The man told him that when Arx grew up, he would surely become an outstanding knight, and he patted the boy on the head. Arx replied that a commoner like him would never become a knight. The mayor disagreed and said that was not true. A boy as smart and strong as Arx would surely make it. The boy smiled even wider. To think that tiny baby had grown into such a fine young man. The mayor told him he had a request. Arx was a little surprised and looked him in the eyes. The mayor took little Arx to that very palace. He sat him down on a beautiful, richly upholstered leather sofa. Arx was frightened and surprised by what was happening. The headman sat down next to him and reassured him. Arx asked him if they had come to the right place. In his opinion, he didn't really fit in here. The headman said that there was a person in this castle who really wanted to meet him. Arx was even more surprised by this. Suddenly, there was a knock at the nearby door. A tall, imposing man in a coat with long hair and a very serious expression came out of the door. It was the Count. He apologized to Arx and the mayor for keeping them waiting. The Count introduced himself and said his name was Adalbert Ancinous, and that he was the Count and ruler of these lands. Arx was very frightened by the Count, but introduced himself in response. He said that he was Arx Leaford. The Count turned to the mayor and asked if this was the boy. The mayor replied that yes, the boy was not without flaws, but he was very capable. The men shook hands. Arx sat motionless and very tense, afraid to make a wrong move. The Count addressed him. He said that rumors of Arx's talents had reached him. He said that he had invited the boy because he had business with him. Arts wondered what kind of flag he had managed to trigger to receive a personal request from the highest nobility. The Count sat down opposite him and folded his arms near his face. With a serious expression, he addressed the boy again. He asked if he could be a friend to his daughter. He said that his daughter had a slight peculiarity. Because of this, it was difficult for her to get along with ordinary people. Arts was surprised. He felt uncomfortable, summoning a commoner orphan to befriend the Count's daughter. And what was this peculiarity? The young man didn't understand. Did she have a bad temper? Or did she throw tantrums? Then Arts realized that the Count had said the surname Antsiness. Suddenly, the Count turned his head and called Eleanor, ordering her to come in. A girl entered, looking sickly and unfriendly, with short dark hair and sad eyes. She was dressed in a gloomy dress and small shoes. The girl introduced herself and bowed, saying she was pleased to meet them, but she did not smile. This is Eleanor Antsiness. Arts sat in shock, deeply surprised. Eleanor Antsiness was the very villain who had tormented the heroine with curses and vicious attacks. The boy was terrified. This girl was the root of all the troubles in the story and the final boss. And Arcs needed to befriend her. The Count brought the children closer to each other and said that he was sure they would find common ground. Eleanor and Arcs looked at each other suspiciously. Count Adalbert suggested that the children talk a little alone. Arcs wanted to object, but didn't and resigned himself to it. In the end, they both left the castle and went out into the courtyard. Arcs and Eleanor walked through the garden and admired its beauty. Arcs noted that the garden was truly magnificent and said that the Count's grandeur was immediately apparent. One could admire it forever. Eleanor replied briefly that the gardener took great care of the entire garden. An awkward pause ensued between them. The young man was very concerned about this and contemplated how to fill the void. Earlier at the castle, the guy had been told that Elin was his age. That's what the Count said, but Arts was interested in something else. Could children really have such an icy gaze? He looked at the girl and thought. Arts thought she was really beautiful. You could immediately see that she was an important person. It was the first time he had seen such a beauty with black hair and eyes. Despite her coldness and unsociability, Arcs noticed that he was staring at her. Then the girl stopped abruptly. She didn't say a word to him. Arcs became concerned and asked her what was wrong. He offered her his arm and suggested they return to the mansion if she wasn't feeling well. Suddenly, Eleanor asked coldly and quietly if Arcs disliked being her friend. She seemed certain of it. Arcs didn't understand and was frightened by the question. Eleanor's eyes were very empty, half dead, and the girl immediately removed her hand from his. She said she understood him. Elin was sure that Arcs didn't like being around a monster like her. Arcs wanted to say the opposite, that it wasn't true at all, but the girl interrupted him. She sadly said that he didn't need to pretend, convincing him that it was normal. Everyone reacted so strangely to her. Other people always pointed at her and said she looked exactly like the rumors described. Eleanor always kept to herself, never talked to anyone, and was the subject of ridicule. People believed that if they stood next to Eleanor, misfortune would befall them too, that there was no light in her eyes, that she was definitely a cursed abomination, that her black hair and black eyes were simply terrifying. She told Arcs that there were those who tried to curry favor with her because of her status, but they were immediately frightened by her magic, which could kill. And after that, other people never spoke to her again. They only glanced at her with disgust. Eleanor told this with a very sad and pensive look, but she was calm. She lowered her head. Arts was confused and wanted to support her, but the girl said she was already used to it, because she knew that this was the right reaction. Her hands gently touched the rose bushes in the garden. Art's expression was frightened, and then he saw her magic. The boy thought that such magic couldn't exist, and that he was seeing such monstrous power for the first time. Under Eleanor's fingers, the wild roses immediately withered. She showed him that all she had to do was touch something, and it would wither, rot, and turn to dust. Plants and people alike. Arts wanted to say something to her, but Elin asked if he now understood that she was a cursed child, and her appearance was truly terrible, frightening, and unfriendly. They walked further into the garden. Arcs had no idea that Eleanor had gone through such an ordeal before becoming the final boss. He wanted to help her. He thought that if that was the reason, then if he saved her now, could he change her fate? He remembered Count Adalbert's request. Arcs didn't understand for a long time why he had been reborn. Maybe it was for this moment? The boy would rewrite this script to hell. To get a good ending in this world, he needed to become her friend and break the flag of a bad ending. In Arcs' opinion, it was true that no one would be unhappy. It would be an ending where no one, including Eleanor, would suffer. He turned to Ms. Eleanor. Arcs confidently stated that, first of all, he did not find her appearance creepy or repulsive. Secondly, he believed exactly the opposite. The guy called her insanely beautiful. Eleanor turned sharply at these words and was surprised. She replied that she was glad Arx thought highly of her, but her power caused people pain. And again, she sadly lowered her head. Arx replied that, of course, there were risks, but he was sure that this power could be used for good. He touched the wilted flower in Eleanor's hands with his hand and revived it with the magic of bloom. Immediately, the rose bloomed in its usual beautiful way. The girl was amazed. At that moment, Arx told her that if she hurt someone with her magic, he would figure something out. He came closer to her and looked into her eyes. The boy asked her to be his friend. No one ever accepted Eleanor. Everyone shouted after her that she was a demon, asked her not to come near anyone because she would infect them with a curse. They called her a cursed crow. It made the girl sad to remember and think about this. She could never find her place in this world. She called out to her mother. The girl wanted to find safety near her. Elin told her mother that she was very scared, very frightened. But her mother looked at her with a cold and indifferent gaze. Eleanor began to cry, and the woman ordered her not to look at her with such tear-filled eyes. It was very cruel. After that, Eleanor apologized to her mother for her weakness and sobbed. She wiped her tears with her hands, and she apologized for being born. But it was all a dream. It was a very dark, gloomy dream about Eleanor's childhood. Suddenly, she heard someone frantically calling her name. It was Arx. The girl woke up in a cold sweat from fear and surprise and opened her eyes. Arx stood over her, frightened, asking if she was all right. He explained that she had had a nightmare. Eleanor slowly and carefully lifted her head from the pillow and sat up. She lowered her gaze and tried to realize that she was no longer in a dream, but in reality. And she continued to remain silent. Arx told her that they had stayed up late talking in her room yesterday, and Elin had fallen asleep from exhaustion. He suggested that it was precisely because of fatigue that the girl had had a bad dream. A smile appeared on the boy's face as he tried to reassure his friend. But Eleanor still sat silently and motionless, staring into space with her piercing gaze. Arx became worried again, and then her eyes quickly and sharply filled with tears. She began to cry bitterly and longingly, making painful sounds. She was in great pain. Arx waved his arms in panic. He hugged Eleanor and offered her his shoulder. She buried her face in it and gradually began to calm down. The girl remembered that she had found someone who sincerely wanted to be her friend. After that, Arx began to tell her about yesterday's conversation in the garden, after which the girl fell asleep exhausted. Yesterday, Eleanor lowered her head and guiltily warned Arx that he would bring misfortune upon himself with her. Arx wanted to cheer her up and replied reassuringly that nothing of the sort would happen, that friendship with her would make him the happiest person alive. But Eleanor did not back down and said sadly that she might hurt him. The boy calmly replied that there were no people who never hurt anyone. Fear was still evident on his face. The girl said that he should find someone else to be his friend, not her. But Arx quickly grabbed Eleanor by the shoulders. He said firmly that he wanted to be with her. Eleanor was surprised. No one had ever said such words to her before. She hesitated for a moment and thought about it. But then she replied that in that case, she hoped they would get along with each other. And now, Arx and Elin are sitting on the edge of her bed. The girl apologized for her behavior yesterday. Arx replied that she shouldn't apologize. He proudly told her that his shoulder was always available if she needed to cry. She replied that he was very kind, and she smiled. Arx smiled back at her and said he had only done what any friend would do. Suddenly, Eleanor became sad again. Her gaze became empty once more. She began to tell him that she had never had any friends or even anyone she could call an ally. Her voice began to tremble with painful memories. She asked if she could be a good friend to Arx. The boy replied that it was no problem at all. The girl clutched the edge of the blanket in her hand, frightened. Arx told her that friendship comes in many forms, and he simply does what his heart tells him to do. Besides, when she made more friends, she would finally understand how it worked. Arx believes that the most important thing in communication is experience, just like in leveling up. The boy smiled and tried to be positive so that Ms. Eleanor wouldn't be so sad. But she covered her mouth with her hand and suggested that Arx not rush into communication. Arx continued to smile and even became a little embarrassed. He replied enthusiastically that life is much, much longer than they can imagine. The guy sat there and sincerely believed in a bright future. After a few weeks, Arx and Eleanor became closer. They spent a lot of time together, and they really enjoyed each other's company. They decided to take another walk in the garden. Eleanor was in a very cheerful, good mood. She happily rounded her eyes and turned to Arx. The girl announced that she had just used magic and the flower in her hands had bloomed. Another day, she offered her friend tea and sweets, standing in front of him with a tray holding 2 cups. And yet another time, the friends looked at the beautiful starry sky together at night. Eleanor pointed to the stars and turned to Arx, saying that the stars were beautiful. She began to sincerely enjoy the little things and simple human joys, completely changing for the better. But Arx did not expect this at all. He was perhaps even in a not very pleasant shock. He believed that these were not just small changes in Eleanor's behavior. It was too sudden a change. At that moment, he was lost in his thoughts and did not hear the girl trying to bring him back to reality. She stood in front of him and asked if he was even listening to her or not. There was less sadness in her eyes than before, but the girl's gaze remained sad nonetheless. And a thought flashed through Ark's mind that Eleanor was still cute, and that made him happy. He casually scratched the back of his head and replied that he was just thinking. A sloppy smile appeared on his face. But Eleanor was a little upset that Arx was lost in thought and not listening to her. She asked him sternly if there could be anything more important than her question, and she lowered her head a little guiltily. She takes such things too much to heart. Arx immediately became concerned about the girl's sadness and took her hand. He immediately declared proudly and decisively that nothing could be more important to him than Lady Eleanor. They stood facing each other, holding hands and looking into each other's eyes. They looked very beautiful together. Eleanor immediately cheered up. Arx immediately thought to himself that Arx Leafort, was damn handsome. Damn handsome. Suddenly, the girl cried out that enough was enough and asked Arx to just tell her what clothes he liked. They were standing in front of a huge wardrobe. Eleanor pushed the guy behind her, facing the wardrobe, so that he would answer her quickly. He raised his head and his gaze wandered. The guy began to think about his clothing preferences. Suddenly, someone outside approached and apologized for the disturbance. It was Mr. Adalbert. He approached Arx and asked him to step outside for a 5-minute conversation. Arx was surprised and began to feel a little afraid. Eleanor also did not expect her father to appear. Mr. Adalbert motioned for them to leave and apologized to his daughter. He explained that he would be stealing Arx away from her for a little while. The boy went with him, feeling afraid. The girl's face changed dramatically, and her previous smile disappeared. Arx immediately understood that Eleanor was very angry about his departure, but there was nothing he could do. Elin turned her head and said that she didn't care about Arx leaving because lately all he had been doing was daydreaming. She rolled her eyes and turned away. But before leaving, Arx addressed her, and he came closer. The guy whispered in her ear that, in his opinion, no matter what she wore, she would look beautiful in everything. The girl's eyes widened, and she blushed a little. Mr. Adalbert was standing a little way off, waiting for the boy. Before leaving, Arx waved goodbye to Eleanor and disappeared with her father. They walked out the door into a large office. The gentleman walked over to the window, leaned his hand on the armchair, and sternly told Arx the news. He had fulfilled the request the young man had asked him earlier. There was no emotion on the Count's face, but Arx was surprised and delighted. Mr. Adalbert announced that starting next week, Arx would officially become a member of the Ancina's family. The young man immediately thanked the Count loudly and sincerely for his approval. However, the Count thoughtfully scratched his chin. He asked if Arx was sure he wanted to become a member of this family. The young man's expression immediately changed. Arx replied that this way he would not have to waste time traveling, and he was grateful to the Count for the job. To which Mr. Adalbert replied that he could simply let Arx stay in this house, without any obligations. But Arx politely declined and replied that he did not want to abuse the Count's kindness. And Mr. Adalbert was pleasantly surprised by such respect. He was amazed that such serious words were spoken to him by a boy of 7 years old. The Count considers this worthy of respect, and an approving smile appeared on his face. Arx cheerfully suggested that it was precisely this wisdom and respect that Adalbert valued when he chose him as a friend for his daughter. The Count smiled and was amazed that the boy had understood even that. And Arx firmly declared that he would try his best. But immediately he told the Count that he wanted to do something else first. They talked among themselves, and Arx returned to Eleanor. The boy walked quickly toward her, thinking that the girl was angry and clearly furious. At that moment, Eleanor was quietly waiting for her friend to arrive, sitting angrily on the sofa. Her face was tense, her knees were shaking, and she was waiting. Suddenly, Arx walked in and called out to her. She indignantly told him that he was late and suggested that he must have had a lot of fun chatting with her father. The girl complained that she was very upset, and her gaze became sadder. Arx entered the room, dressed up. He was wearing a strict black bow tie, a neat jacket, and a shirt. He called his girlfriend, ma'am, and apologized politely for being late. The young man approached her and knelt down on one knee. He announced that Arx Leafort had arrived and that from that day forward, he would be Lady Eleanor's personal servant. The girl was pleasantly shocked, as she had not expected such a gesture. The young man took her hand and looked her straight in the eyes. He told her that he was now devoting himself entirely to serving her. Eleanor was too shocked to respond, staring at him with wide, surprised eyes. Arx asked her to trust him and rely on him. The main hall of the mansion was decorated with jewels, beautiful ornaments, and garlands. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows. Chandeliers hung charmingly from the ceiling, and the diamonds on them sparkled even more brightly in the sun. A festive and luxurious atmosphere reigned throughout the mansion. Maids in kitchen aprons ran back and forth between the rooms and the hall. They quickly and responsibly carried trays of dishes and prepared for the celebration. One of the maids noticed that there were not enough glasses on her tray and panicked. She quickly ordered someone to inform the supplier so that they could replace the aperitif. Other employees discussed the placement of security guards in the main hall. Arx sat tiredly at a table in another room, his head resting on his hands. It had been 3 years since he became a servant in this house, and soon Eleanor would turn 10. In this world and in this mansion, it was customary to celebrate milestone birthdays in style. And now they were up to their ears in preparations for this celebration. Arx suddenly realized that he had underestimated the ways of the nobility. Suddenly, a maid knocked on the door, a young girl in an apron, with light hair tied back in a casual bun. She opened the door, addressed Mr. Arx, and informed him that the hall was ready. This maid's name was Nanai. Mr. Arx sincerely thanked Nanai for her work. The girl smiled sweetly at this, but immediately she noticed that Arx looked very tired. The guy replied that yes, he was indeed very tired. He explained that the day before a holiday was always hectic. Arx raised his arms and stretched after his nap. Nanai warmly replied that thanks to him, they were completely ready for tomorrow. A sweet smile lit up her face. Arx smiled back at her and said that was very good. That's all well and good, but even though Arx is only 10 years old, he is in charge of this party. All the mansion's employees constantly run him around doing all sorts of things, calling him for help, asking him to come over for a minute, or he has to solve various problems. The adults constantly put him in charge. He just gave advice based on common sense from his past life. So why did everything turn out this way? Nanai saw Arx's anxiety and thoughtfulness and said in a kind voice that Arx was truly wonderful. She believed it herself. She confirmed her words by saying that Arx not only offered great ideas, but also did a good job himself. Arx thought for a moment and replied to the girl's words. All his efforts and hard work were only for the sake of Lady Eleanor. The boy's eyes sparkled. This was the first luxurious reception of guests at the mansion since Arx and Eleanor had met. The boy really wanted to throw a grand party and finally see the happy face of his beloved friend. Arx sincerely believed that it was worth enduring the fatigue for this. Create stone. Arx stood up from the table and uttered this spell, and a thick stone sword appeared in his hands. The maid was still standing in the doorway, proud of Arx. The guy cheerfully warned her and said that he was going to practice. He was about to leave, waving goodbye. Nanai began to worry because Arx had been complaining of severe fatigue, and now he was suddenly going to practice. She wondered when Arx had managed to change his clothes. The boy didn't understand this himself, but then he guessed that it was the magic of healing and restoration. He explained this to the maid. A broad, polite smile appeared on his face, and as he said goodbye, Arx declared that they needed to work hard for glory. Nanai smiled and chuckled sweetly at this cheerfulness. Arx Leafort went out into the garden. He practiced a little. He swung his magic sword in the air and raised his level. After a while, he got tired and decided that he had had enough training for today. The guy put his sword on the ground and began to rest. Suddenly, he heard someone call his name from behind. Arx turned around in fright and wanted to check the surroundings. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared among the blooming rose bushes. It was Lady Eleanor. She was dressed in a beautiful, long sundress, but her eyes still held the same despair, sadness, and sorrow. Arx was a little startled and did not expect to see his friend. He asked how long she had been standing there. The girl quietly replied that it hadn't been long. Arx hadn't noticed her at all, and he was a little worried about that. The boy apologized to Mrs. Eleanor and smiled awkwardly. The girl also smiled gently in response, but said nothing. She stood timidly, quietly, without making any unnecessary sounds. Arx was concerned that Eleanor had probably been standing in the garden for a long time and might have caught a cold. He told her this and asked why she had done so. Why was she standing next to him? Eleanor looked him straight in the eye and thought aloud that even if she had gotten cold, Arx would warm her up. The guy was embarrassed. He thought, well, of course, there's the magic of fire or body heat, but couldn't Lady Eleanor do it herself? Arx was embarrassed, but a little puzzled in his thoughts, and Eleanor began to speak indignantly. She complained to the boy that, on top of everything else, he had been so busy lately that he hardly ever saw her. She said this in a sad and pitiful voice. Arx looked down and scratched the back of his head. He didn't know how to answer her, even though they talked and saw each other at least once a day. Eleanor continued, saying that yes, he belonged to her. She immediately took back her words and changed their meaning. She meant that Arx was her servant, and shouldn't he be with her all the time? There was longing in her eyes, and her voice trembled with indignation and resentment that he spent so little time with her. Arx began to repent and sincerely apologized to her. He also wanted to see her more often, but he was too busy right now. The boy clutched his glove and shirt in his hands out of nervousness and anxiety. He hastily kissed Eleanor's hand and said that all his busyness was for tomorrow's sake. Arx explained that he wanted to congratulate Lady Eleanor in a dignified manner. The girl was so surprised that she even began to stutter a little. She replied quietly that if that was the case, there was nothing to be done. Tomorrow was an important day for them. But she quickly pulled her hand away from his lips and looked at the boy suspiciously. Arx suggested that they both return to the mansion so that the girl wouldn't get cold. It was already dark outside, and night was falling. Eleanor suddenly asked Arx seriously if he was lonely. Arx replied with a smile and a slight mockery that he wasn't. He explained that Mr. Adalbert and the other servants were very kind to him. Eleanor remained silent, not knowing how to respond. All emotion quickly disappeared from her face. Arx noticed this. The boy wondered anxiously if he had said something wrong. Eleanor replied with a frown that they had to go and that she was counting on him tomorrow. And so they approached the doors of the mansion. Suddenly, Arx sneezed, but Eleanor remained silent and did not attach any importance to it. The children went into the house. A new morning dawned, an important day, Mrs. Eleanor's birthday. The mansion sparkled with decorations inside. Garlands hung everywhere, lights and lanterns burned. Flowers were laid out everywhere. A red carpet was laid out on the stairs. The diamonds in the chandeliers sparkled in the sunlight that streamed through the hall window. Guests had already begun to gather in the main hall. The celebration was about to begin. Mr. Adalbert stood on a high staircase and addressed everyone present. He thanked everyone for gathering here today. Arx stood nearby. Count Adalbert asked the boy to remove all annoying insects that might approach Mrs. Eleanor. He meant, and all the other boys who might harm her or have bad intentions. Arx replied that he would certainly carry out the order. And immediately below, at the foot of the stairs, he saw two unfamiliar boys. They seemed suspicious to Arx. They were dressed identically, in formal attire, vests, business shorts, and ties. Arx felt like he had seen them somewhere before. The three of them suddenly looked at each other, and their eyes met. Arx turned away sharply so that they would not think anything of him. He did not want them to notice him, but it seemed that the boys had noticed that Arx was looking at them. And suddenly, the two strangers disappeared. Arx didn't understand. At that moment, the female host spoke into the microphone. She asked everyone to welcome the birthday girl, Eleanor, and to look at her magnificent outfit. Eleanor came out to the guests in a beautiful and expensive long dress. It was floor-length, with thin sleeves and an open top. The dress was dark in color, decorated with flowers and a large fluffy bow on the skirt. The birthday girl's hair was neatly curled and styled, and her face was calm and beautiful at the same time. The guests saw her and immediately rejoiced, staring at her. Eleanor was led up the stairs by her maid Nanai, who was also dressed up and joyful. Arx began to look at her, even staring, admiring her. Eleanor looked at him approvingly in return and smiled. Arx's heart fluttered. The maid led the birthday girl up the stairs and past the guests. Arx caught himself having an interesting thought. He thought Eleanor was gorgeous and couldn't understand how children could grow so quickly in 3 years. Since he was in charge of the process today, it was a pity that he couldn't be with her. But Nanai called him. Arx ran up to her and asked what had happened, and where was Lady Eleanor's escort. He was very frightened and alarmed. Nanai wanted to talk to him about it. The look of bewilderment disappeared from Arx's face, and after the conversation, Arx found himself on the throne next to the birthday girl. He was curious as to why everything had turned out this way. The boy was very tense as he sat there. The glances of the other guests burned into him. It seemed to him that everyone was wondering who he was. Eleanor was sitting next to him and noticed that Arx was quite pale. She asked her friend if he was all right. He replied indignantly that his paleness and fear were her fault. Eleanor frowned and was at a loss for words, but she immediately said that her servant Arx was not paying any attention to her. The boy replied that this did not mean he should be seated next to her on the throne. A simple servant sits next to the guest of honor. For Arx, it was frightening, unbearable, and shameful. Eleanor replied that he was not a simple servant, and she lowered her head. Arx replied that he was flattered, but the guests did not seem to be. Eleanor also believes that Arx should be congratulated. He didn't know that and was very surprised. Eleanor replied that yes, Arx was her age, and the boy replied that yes, that was true. The girl then asked if no one was congratulating him. Was that right? Arx was in shock and didn't know what to say. Recent events had exhausted him. Since his exact date of birth was unknown, no one had ever really congratulated him. Everyone just guessed his age and asked him directly and figured that the boy was probably around 10 too. Just like Eleanor. but she thought that was wrong. So the birthday girl sat him next to her so that he would be treated like another birthday boy. That's why Arx thought that Mrs. Eleanor had a very kind heart. Who would have thought that pessimistic girl would grow up like that? The boy was sure that she would never become the final boss. He said it was an honor for him, and he was happy that Lady Eleanor had congratulated him. That was enough for him. He said this and smiled sweetly, lowering his gaze, a little embarrassed, placing his hand on his heart as a sign of propriety. Eleanor was surprised by his actions and words. She turned to him in alarm and asked him to stay with her afterwards. Arx thought that, for Eleanor's sake, he wanted this party to go perfectly. Arx remembered the two boys who had disappeared earlier. He hoped that nothing bad would happen because of them. Meanwhile, one of the boys watched Eleanor and Arx from afar, keeping an eye on them. Eleanor and Arx were still sitting next to each other on their thrones, and the guests were still staring at them intently. Suddenly, Eleanor turned to Arx and politely asked if he had tried the food. In her hand was a fork with some delicious food from the table. She wanted her friend to try it, but Arx sat silently and very tensely, unable to move. Meanwhile, Eleanor offered the boy other delicacies from the festive table one after another. She did not leave him unattended at the party. Arx caught himself thinking that everyone was staring at them intently. The boy definitely did not like this. Suddenly, one of the guests turned to Mrs. Eleanor and reassured her, asking her to be patient a little longer. Arx didn't understand who it was. He decided not to go into details, as he was already feeling very uncomfortable. Suddenly, another young man, about the same age as her, approached the birthday girl, dressed in a neat and important trouser suit. His hair was beautifully styled, and a tie was visible under his waistcoat. He bowed politely to the lady and addressed her. He asked Eleanor Ancinous, the Count's daughter, to dance with him. There was a strong sense of confidence and determination in the eyes of this unfamiliar guy. It was as if he knew that she would not refuse to dance with him. Arx sat, looked at him, and realized that this guy was the one. He remembered his face. Arx guessed that he was Reijou Kilmond, the son of the Viscount. Arx didn't recognize him because he looked much younger than at the beginning of the game. Reijou never loved anyone and called them rotten mobs. He was too self-absorbed. Arx considered him a rude tyrant. However, Reijou Kilmond was devoted to the main character, and thanks to this contrast, he is very popular. He was the beloved from the game Kingdom of Celestia. Arx's train of thought was interrupted by another phrase from the boy. Reijou repeated his request. He asked if Eleanor had heard him. He said he would honor her with a dance. He even offered his hand to the girl. Eleanor and Arx did not move from their places and looked at the boy. The girl was surprised by Reijou's request. She was not used to being asked to dance, but Reijou asked her again. She thought for a moment. She looked at him questioningly and sternly stated that she refused to dance. Reijou definitely did not expect to hear a refusal. He flew into a rage and lashed out with profanity out of anger and surprise. Eleanor's face was completely calm. Reijou asked sharply, "Why are you refusing?" The birthday girl replied that it was quite natural. She had no desire to dance with him, and that was obvious. She wanted to say something else, but Reijou interrupted her. He was furious, his face contorted with bitterness, jealousy, and resentment. The guy already swung his arm at the girl in a fit of rage. But Arx, who was standing nearby, managed to stop him. He grabbed Reijou's arm and prevented trouble from happening. Eleanor stood there, frightened. Arx's eyes were empty, his face devoid of any emotion. Reijou did not expect such an action, and he became even angrier. He shouted and asked angrily what Arx was doing. The boy replied in a serious and authoritative voice that he was Arx Leaford, a servant of Lady Eleanor. Reijou did not take these words seriously and ordered Arx not to be insolent. But Arx continued to squeeze his enemy's hand violently. The boy said that his job was to protect Lady Eleanor, and he intended to fulfill his duty. Confidence appeared in Arx's eyes. Reijou wanted to break free from his grip, but he couldn't. He told Arx that this was violence and explained that he only wanted to ask Eleanor to dance. But Arx did not back down. Without shouting or showing emotion, he asked Reijou to calm down. And, according to Arx, if Reijou made a scandal out of this, he would disgrace his family. His opponent began to shout, asking why, and what did disgrace have to do with it? Arx said that if the Viscount's son harmed the Count's daughter, or even her servant, it would become a problem, and he asked Reijou if he agreed. Because it was really true, Arx spoke very seriously and confidently, even though he was only 10 years old, and Reijou Kilmond fell silent. Once again, a flood of thoughts overwhelmed Arx. The boy believed that Reijou was not stupid, but simply a petty brat. Although they were the same age, Arx still couldn't understand whether such behavior was normal for a 10-year-old boy. He told his opponent that if he backed down now, he would not report it to the clan chief. So, he asked Eleanor to back down. Reijou replied briefly that he understood, and they let each other go, ceasing to resist. Before leaving, Razor bared his teeth and smiled maliciously in farewell. But he didn't leave. Instead, he suddenly attacked and pushed Arx. The boy did not expect such a despicable and vile action and wanted to ask what he was doing. But suddenly Arx was hit in the face. Razor wanted to strike him. Arx tried to get out from under his opponent and punch him in the face, but Razor was faster and stronger than him. Despite this, Arx considered Razor to be a noble snob. That dealing with him was a pain. That it was all a dream. He even found it funny that Razor was putting on this whole circus in all seriousness. Meanwhile, his opponent sat on top of him and was already preparing to punch Arx in the face with all his might. He shouted and ranted, "How dare Arx disgrace him like this?" But suddenly Razor saw his brother, Caesar Kilmond, and rushed into his arms. The guy bowed before Nanai. Razor ordered Lord Kilmond and Mr. Adalbert to be summoned. The girl called them and carried out the order. Eleanor stood nearby and was terribly frightened for her servant, calling for help. Arx got up from the floor and dusted himself off. The guy asked Mrs. Eleanor if she was okay. Was she hurt? They went out into the hallway and discussed it. The girl replied that she was perfectly fine. There were witnesses to this fight. She asked Arx not to worry about her, but about himself first. Eleanor came closer to him and took his face in her delicate hands. She looked at him closely and asked if he was okay. Arx was confused and still shaken from the fight. He was scared. Eleanor noticed with concern that Arx's cheek was swollen. But the boy replied that it was nothing serious and smiled. He was glad that the lady was unharmed. Before that, other guests and servants had asked Arx how he was feeling. He thanked everyone for their concern and replied that everything was fine. But Mrs. Eleanor was genuinely frightened for her friend and looked at him with worried and sad eyes. Arx suddenly walked away to the main hall. Caesar Kilman knelt before Arx and bowed to the floor. He prayed before him and sincerely apologized for his brother's behavior. He tearfully said that his brother had caused him trouble and that he was very sorry. Arx replied that he shouldn't do that. He awkwardly asked him to lift his head off the floor. Caesar Kilmond is also one of the beloved. He is a Prince Charming type character with a gentle disposition. The young man finally got up from the floor, sat down on the sofa in front of Arx, and apologized again, saying that he was truly sorry. Caesar Kilmond has always fought for first place in the popularity rankings. He explained that it was hard to have a brother who was a problem child. His brother was spoiled as a child, which is probably why he got the impression that he could get whatever he wanted. Arx guessed and replied that Razor really wanted to dance with Mrs. Eleanor. Caesar confirmed this. Razor wanted to dance like a boy in elementary school. Although, judging by his age, Arx thinks Razor is actually a junior high school student. His eyes were very sad. Caesar said that he had only advised his brother to ask the girl he was interested in to dance. Arx sat in a chair in front of the boy and remained silent. Caesar laid his head heavily on the sofa and asked what would happen to Razor now. He was terribly worried. They were told that much depended on Lord Adalbert's decision, and at the very least, Razor's exile was inevitable. Arx was frightened and guessed that exile was the most terrible banishment. Arx and Caesar's faces were filled with horror. Arx began to think. He realized that this was very bad. He was trembling with excitement at hearing a word that only exists in fantasy. Even though he was only 10, he was almost an adult in this world. In Arx's opinion, that was probably fair. He would have been happier not to wake up. However, Arx thought again. At this point, beloved Viscount Razor Kilman disappeared. Is this world beginning to deviate from the main plot of the game? Arx thinks it would be good if Eleanor's fate changed as well. And so he returned to his mistress. She was frightened. She asked why he had been gone for so long. The girl asked if he was all right. Arx replied that everything was fine, and the witnesses were fine too. He explained that he just needed time to accept the apology. Eleanor digested his words, but Arx apologized to her. He said he had ruined the long-awaited birthday party. Eleanor was outraged by this. She asked sharply why he was apologizing to her. The girl believed that the guy who behaved like a robber was to blame. However, Arx replied that he could have prevented all this if he hadn't been so naive. If he had remembered earlier. No, if he had carefully checked the guest list, he could have weeded him out before inviting him. Eleanor couldn't listen to this anymore and stopped him. She stepped closer to him and took his face in her hands. Arx didn't expect this and was a little embarrassed, his eyes widening. The girl told him straight to his face that as long as Arx was by her side, she didn't care about anyone else. Her eyes were full of hope, her anger and rage gone, her indignation gone. And the boy was still surprised by this. Eleanor added that, besides, it was still unknown whether Arx had ruined the holiday or not. They headed for the door. Mrs. Eleanor mysteriously suggested that Arx take a little walk outside. It was already night outside. The trees rustled quietly with their leaves. The stars in the sky shone brighter than the birthday girl's dress. Arx and Eleanor went out for a short walk in the garden. There was a calm and friendly atmosphere between them. Arx was a little concerned about his friend's condition, and decided to ask a question. He asked if Mrs. Eleanor had danced with anyone. There was a small, simple smile on his face, but his eyes showed despair. Eleanor sadly lowered her head, shrugged her shoulders, and gently replied that no, she had not danced with anyone. The girl explained that she had declined all invitations. She touched her face because she was nervous. Arx was a little surprised by this. His eyes widened. He believed that dancing was a normal activity for the nobility, the main event of the evening. To find a good match, to establish connections. Arx didn't understand. Wasn't that the purpose of dancing at a celebration? He timidly asked Eleanor why she had refused. She lowered her eyes, a little embarrassed, and replied that she wanted to give her first dance to Arx. Her eyes became very sweet, but at the same time very wistful and sad. Arx became nervous and surprised, standing in shock, confused. He even asked her again if she was sure. Eleanor continued and said that, in fact, she had wanted to ask him to dance yesterday, but she couldn't because she didn't have the courage. The girl became embarrassed, shy, tense, lowered her gaze and head, and clasped her hands. After that, Arx understood why Ms. Eleanor had been acting so strangely yesterday. The boy gently asked if she was sure she wanted to dance with someone like him. He explained that he had never danced before either. The boy stood rooted to the spot. He was in shock and reeling from the news he had heard. Eleanor turned to him and said sarcastically, smiling, that she wasn't very good at it either. She cheerfully opened her slender, delicate arms and turned to Arx. Eleanor declared that no one would see them here. She was ready to start dancing right away. Her eyes lit up with hope for the best, positivity, and sincere joy at the prospect of dancing. She noticed that even the moon had disappeared behind the clouds for this. Arx noticed this too and replied that yes, it was indeed true. The boy believed that if he embarrassed himself in the dance now, it would not be so shameful. He smiled sweetly at his partner and was friendly. They moved closer to each other. Eleanor tried to calm Arx down and said that even if he stumbled, only she would know about it. The boy replied that if that was the case, then he agreed. Eleanor politely addressed Mr. Arx and asked if he would do her the honor of dancing with her. Arx smiled in response and replied that yes, he would, with great pleasure. And so they began to dance. Smooth, gentle movements, the light tapping of Eleanor's shoes. Her hair fluttered in the air and shimmered in the light of the moon, which had already emerged from behind the clouds. Arx tried to lead the waltz very carefully and gently, so as not to embarrass himself in front of the lady. Even though neither of them knew how to dance and had never danced before, they still looked wonderful. Meanwhile, the seconds passed quickly as they danced, and Eleanor and Arx returned to the party. In general, no one noticed their absence, except for a group of boys invited to the party. As soon as Arx entered the room, he was mobbed by a group of unfamiliar boys about his age. They were dressed in expensive suits, as befits guests at a high society party in a mansion. They were shouting, very excited, and wouldn't let Arx pass. One of them turned to the boy and asked if Arx wanted to come work for him. He would pay as much as Arx wanted, and this unfamiliar boy really wanted Arx to become his servant. They seemed to be mocking him, trying to humiliate him. Arx stood in front of them in shock, unable to say a word because they had attacked him so loudly and unexpectedly. His eyes were empty. He didn't understand what was going on. Eleanor was standing nearby, but she didn't want to take part in these conversations. Another boy from this strange company noticed and said that Arx had very decisively rebuffed the Kilman family son. He praised Arx and said that it was truly magnificent. And what precision and skill in magic. The boy praised Arx as much as he could, but it still sounded more like sarcasm. He loudly declared that he wanted Arx to be his servant. Arx understood what was going on after all this praise. He asked the boys to calm down and behave more modestly. Arx shielded himself from them with his hands, created boundaries, and apologized. After all, he was already a servant of Lady Eleanor. The girl stood nearby and smiled sweetly at this. They looked at each other and nodded approvingly, smiling. Although Eleanor herself did not understand and did not hear what this group of unfamiliar guests wanted from Arx, but she was very happy that Arx was infinitely devoted to her. So, the long birthday party was coming to an end. The glasses were already empty, and there was no food left on the tables. Arx thought that after the party was over, he would finally be able to relax, but that was not the case. He takes back his words. Parties are not only about preparation, but also about cleaning up afterwards. Arx helped the workers and maids clear the table, take down the decorations, and return the main hall and the entire mansion to its proper, former state. He wondered if they would all manage to finish cleaning the mansion before midnight. Arx realized that next time he needed to take a simpler position. He went to his room to rest. Suddenly, someone knocked quietly on the door and called him. It was Nanai. She cheerfully announced that the cleaning of the hall was complete. Arx was pleasantly surprised and delighted. The maid Nanai smiled broadly and did not look tired at all. She explained why the cleaning had gone so quickly. It was because all the workers around had seen how hard Mr. Arks was working and cleaning, and they had been inspired too. Arks sat in his hall worker's uniform, tired and exhausted, a little surprised by Nanai's words and the fact that someone was following his example. The boy asked if it was really thanks to him that the cleaning was finished faster. Nanai proudly and happily confirmed that yes, it was indeed so. She stood in the doorway and was very happy. Arks understood the reason for such a quick cleanup, but it made him feel awkward. Nanai smiled and said that Mrs. Eleanor liked everything and that the effort was worth it. Arks smiled back and said he thought so too. Suddenly, Nanai decided to go into the room. Arks was sitting on the floor in front of the box. Nanai sat down next to him, also on her knees, and suddenly her expression changed. Her happy smile turned into a wistful and slightly sad smile. She began to help him sort through the things in the box. At the same time, she said in a very nostalgic voice that looking at Arks somehow reminded her of the past. Arks did not expect such a sincere and nostalgic conversation between them, so he tensed up a little. The maid told her story and explained herself. Once, long ago, she had organized a party for her childhood friend's 10th birthday. They were both orphans, so their party was very modest. Nanai just wanted to cheer up her friend a little. She said this in a very sad voice. It hurt her a little to remember it. The girl turned to Arks and said that he reminded her a lot of herself back then. She asked if Arks and Eleanor were also childhood friends. Weren't they? Nanai smiled. Eleanor and Arks really did get along well with each other. But the boy thought about it seriously and looked a little downcast. Nanai explained that this was why she felt so nostalgic. She continued rummaging through the large box and smiled sweetly at the boy. But Arks was lost in deep thought. What was it? In his opinion, something didn't add up. Eleanor's childhood friend? Arks couldn't remember if there was such a character in the game Kingdom of Celestia. The boy became excited and anxious. No, he thought that his very existence was already a deviation from the canon, so this was natural. Arks didn't understand where this strange feeling of anxiety had suddenly come from. He thought about Eleanor and became completely immersed in his own world, in his own thoughts. Suddenly, Nanai called out to him because she couldn't get through to him at that moment. She asked if he was okay, because she noticed that he looked very lost. Arks replied that no, nothing was wrong, and that he was just thinking. They were still unpacking boxes and tidying up, sitting on their knees on the floor of the boys' room. Nanai suggested that Arks was probably tired, which was why he was lost in thought. She suggested that he go to bed early and get some rest. Meanwhile, another maid walked past the entrance to the room and called out to Nanai. Outside, there was still work to be done throughout the mansion. The girl was asked to come and help for a moment. Nanai replied that she would be right there. She turned to the workers and suggested they hurry up a little. Nanai was cheerful and sweet again and immediately left Ark's room. The boy did not resist and agreed with her. He understood that he also needed to finish the work quickly. His face showed sadness, fatigue, and confusion. And suddenly he fell asleep from the fatigue that had overwhelmed him from work and cleaning. The boy lay down next to his large box and fell asleep. Only after some time did he suddenly realize that he had fallen asleep. In his opinion, this was bad, very bad. He immediately began to rush around the room, looking for his things, because he was still dressed in his waiter's uniform. The boy remembered that Eleanor had told him to come back after the cleaning was finished. He was frightened and worried. Now, Arks thinks that Mrs. Eleanor will be upset with him for a whole week because of this. And immediately the boy became dejected. Then he rushed out of his room into the large corridor. An expensive chandelier with diamonds hung from the ceiling. All the walls were decorated with stained glass patterns, mosaics, and painted murals. At the ends of the hallway were several large, bright doors leading to other rooms. But it was already late at night outside, and the hallway was very dark. Arks saw strange things, heard strange sounds, and had strange visions everywhere. But he paid no attention to it, and thought it was all in his imagination. He carefully approached the door that led to Mrs. Eleanor's room. He knocked quietly on the door with his finger, apologizing. He said he was late and introduced himself so that his friend would recognize him and open the door. But the door did not open for a long time. Arks realized that Mrs. Eleanor was already asleep. He looked devotedly at the tall door and resigned himself to defeat. The boy decided to try again and apologize to Eleanor tomorrow morning. He couldn't wake her up in the middle of the night just to apologize. Suddenly, black spots appeared in the air. The sharp sound and jolt startled the boy. He was very frightened and fell to the floor screaming. The door leading to Eleanor's room slammed loudly and abruptly. A dark, magical, and incomprehensible body appeared in front of Arks in midair. He sat on the floor near the door, terrified, and stared at this mystical sight. There was horror in his eyes. Arks did not understand what had just happened. Suddenly, he cried out Eleanor's name. He had seen her in this magic, but he thought she was in the room. He was afraid for her and wanted to know where she was. The boy screamed, calling out to Eleanor, wanting to see her, very frightened. He wondered if she was okay. And suddenly, black branches of magic moved closer and closer to Arx from the air. Arx's fear and anxiety at that moment cannot be conveyed in words. He crawled closer to the door on the floor and tried to get away, but he couldn't. And suddenly, among the thick black magic, neat female legs appeared, barefoot and frightening. They strode with a rumble across the floor toward Arx. The boy realized that his body was not obeying him and that he needed to get up. He thought that things were bad, and he was frightened by the events. His face was filled with horror. Arx struggled to get up from the floor and close his eyes in fear. A female silhouette appeared in the thick magic, painfully familiar to Arx. Long dark hair gathered into a neat hairstyle. A light-colored knee-length dress with sleeves. And a familiar face. She addressed Arx by name, in a calm, quiet, empty voice. Arx wanted to look at her. It was Lady Eleanor. Her completely blank face showed no emotion. Her gaze was glassy, her smile silent. Arx cried out because he recognized his mistress, Eleanor. Arx watched in fear as if spellbound. He called to her, tried to calm her down, wanted to hear her voice. The boy's eyes were full of incomprehension and bewilderment, fear and anxiety. He had never seen this magic before. He called out to his mistress repeatedly. Black branches of magic spread across the floor and Eleanor's legs. She looked at him and began to come to her senses. The girl's face was filled with the same sadness she had carried throughout her life. And then she called out to him in response, in a quiet, thin voice. But suddenly the girl raised her voice and declared sharply that he was too late. Her eyes changed immediately, and so did her whole expression. The sadness was gone, replaced by indignation. Her gaze became sharp as a knife, and she appeared determined. Arx clearly did not expect such a sudden change in his friend's behavior, and the magic suddenly disappeared, and everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. After a while, Arx and Eleanor found themselves in a room resembling a living room or kitchen in a mansion. They sat down next to each other at a large, spacious table. On this table were several small plates with pieces of chocolate cake, cutlery, glasses, and a larger plate with fragrant cookies. Arx sat at the table feeling very tense and lost. He had not yet recovered from Eleanor's magic. Eleanor put a neat little apron on him so that the boy would not get his clothes dirty. The girl moved one of the plates with cake toward him and suggested that Arx had been so busy working that he had completely forgotten to eat. She said that she had prepared a special treat for him. Arx was too shocked to speak, staring at the food apprehensively and barely breathing. His eyes were wide with fear, his hair tousled. Eleanor stood up, patted her friend on the shoulder, and insisted that he try her treat. A smile lit up her face, her anger and indignation disappeared, and there was no trace of sadness left. Finally, Arx began to come to his senses and understood something. He said that if Nanai found out that he and Eleanor were eating sweets at such a late hour, she would be angry. Eleanor carefully took a cookie in her hand and wanted to give it to Arx. At that moment, she declared that she and the boy were now accomplices. Eleanor approached Arx, looked him in the eyes, and held out the cookie. Arx was still tense, but now he was calm. The boy was thinking. He wondered where Eleanor had learned to do this. Had she picked it up from him? But Arx began to resist and made the girl stop. She put the cookies back on the table, on the plate. Eleanor said that today was her birthday, so it was okay today. Arx took her hand and looked into her eyes. He asked the most important question that interested him. He asked what the magic he had just seen was. By this time, they had moved to the sofa in the living room. Outside the window, it was pitch dark. Eleanor stood there frightened and pulled her hand away from his. Her eyes showed disbelief, sadness, and fear. She became a little sad and lowered her head. The girl didn't want to talk about it and changed the subject. She asked Arx to make her some tea. Arx did not resist and went to the teapot. While the tea was brewing, Eleanor found herself once again in the clutches of black magic. Arx noticed this and turned around, tense and frightened once again. Eleanor said with determination that it was her innate power, her Celestia. It was magic given to every person. Arx stared with his large, mesmerized eyes at the girl's magic. Everyone has Celestia, and no one but the owner can use it. This is the key mechanic that makes the game, Kingdom of Celestia, unique. Arx plucked up the courage to ask how long ago Eleanor had acquired this magic. He knew about Eleanor's Celestia from a game, of course. He had seen many scenes where she wreaked havoc with this power. Arx poured tea from the teapot into a cup. The girl lowered her head. She apologized and explained that she didn't mean to scare the boy. She replied that it seemed to have been last month. She woke up and darkness filled the entire room. Arx asked in surprise and horror if it had really been that long ago. He asked Mrs. Eleanor why she hadn't told him earlier. The girl sat down on the sofa and explained with a sad look on her face. She said she couldn't bring herself to talk about it because she was afraid of Ark's reaction. Eleanor clenched her hand into a fist near her chest. Arx realized that it had indeed been a good decision, because if he had seen it with his own eyes, he would have been very frightened. The boy understood why she was called the cursed child and enemy of humanity. Suddenly, Eleanor smiled and proudly announced that it was convenient. After all, it was easy to carry things just like now. She demonstrated her magical abilities, but she received no response or words from Arx. He sat there with a lost look on his face. She got up from the sofa, walked over to Arx, and said that lately he seemed out of sorts. After all, when he was pushed today, Eleanor let it slip a little. The girl recalled these difficult moments throughout the day and was worried. And then she was convinced. Eleanor decided to ask Arx if she really was cursed. No matter how hard the girl tried to hold back, this nasty force still came out. The children sat next to each other on the sofa. Eleanor turned to Arx and said that, in the end, he would also disappear. Arx wanted to object. How can you say that? But she interrupted him. Horror appeared in the boy's eyes, and he even opened his mouth in surprise. And Eleanor said in a sad voice that her mother had said the same words to her before she left, and then disappeared. Arx began to ponder. Mother Eleanor, who had never appeared in the game or in this world. Here, at the estate, Eleanor had never mentioned her, and the girl began to remember her early childhood, her past. She said that her mother also couldn't control magic, and she hugged her when everyone shunned the girl. Then Eleanor cried, and her mother comforted her. But when the girl turned 5, her mother also disappeared. They say she returned to her parents' house, and Eleanor thinks that her mother just doesn't want to see her. Arx was even more surprised than before. He hadn't expected to hear such revelations and memories about Lady Eleanor's mother. And the girl continued to remember and tell with longing and sadness. Those gloomy eyes when they first met. Arx understood that there was no denying how deeply Eleanor's heart was wounded, and he realized that she really did have such a dark and difficult past. The girl said that everything was fine now. She was sure that this was her fate, and there was nothing she could do about it. The fact that her own mother had abandoned her could not be changed. She wanted to say that surely no one needed her, but Arx didn't let her say those words, because it wasn't true. He took her by the shoulders and began to shout her name loudly to finally get through to her. Eleanor was in shock, and so was Arx, but he kept trying. He wanted to accept her. Arx declared that being hated was not her destiny, and he would not let the girl fall into darkness. Arx was confident in his words, determined. Let the evil tongues judge Lady Eleanor as they please. He believes that maybe her Celestia really scares people, but still, he would never let go of her hand. Arx was bolder and braver than ever, looking his friend straight in the eyes. Eleanor was a little shocked, even a little lost, because she did not expect such loud words. They continued to sit on the sofa and next to each other, holding hands. But Arx was worried about Eleanor's reaction. He was afraid that he might have said something he shouldn't have, although he thought that if he blurted something out like that suddenly, it probably sounded creepy. But Eleanor did not back down from her negative thoughts. She was sure that she was really no good. Arx wanted to calm her down and change her mind, but she suddenly smiled slightly. The girl said that, in fact, she had secretly hoped that Arx would say exactly that. She had been waiting for those words. Her eyes sparkled again, and a sweet smile appeared. Arx, sitting opposite her, smiled just as sweetly and blushed. He looked at her kindly and couldn't take his eyes off her. He replied that he could repeat those words as many times as she wanted, because it was true. The boy gently stroked his friend's cheek. She blushed. After that, they hugged each other like friends. Arx realized that he wanted to protect Eleanor, as a friend, as a servant, and even as a childhood friend. Stop. Arx caught himself having a bad thought, which he needed to stop thinking about. He became curious as to why Eleanor had fallen into darkness in the original story. Bullying from early childhood? Was that the only reason? No, now the boy understood. Everything became clear from his conversation with Eleanor. Suddenly, Arx's stream of thoughts was interrupted by Eleanor's words. She said in a quiet and trusting voice that she would surely go mad if Arx didn't. Her sweet, gentle smile was more precious to Arx than anything else, and her eyes slightly narrowed with pleasure and sadness at the same time. The boy suddenly came to his senses and returned from his thoughts to reality. He was a little worried about his friend's words. She gently stroked his face with her hand and said some important words. It's just that when she thinks that Arx might disappear, scary thoughts come in her head. Arx smiled and asked Ms. Eleanor to stop joking like that. And then, sure enough, he remembered. He really would disappear. The game's lore contained important information. Eleanor Ancinous, the final boss of this game. She commands sinister black tentacles, tormenting the main character and everyone around him. However, the reason for her evil deeds was a difficult past. She fell into darkness, mourning a childhood friend who died when she was little. Arx was sure that if things continued this way, he would most likely die 5 years after the start of the game, at the age of 15. And that is why Eleanor will turn to the dark side and become the final boss, bringing suffering. Suddenly, Eleanor's words interrupted Arx's train of thought again. She called out to him anxiously because she noticed once more that he was not himself, lost in thought, tense and confused. The girl asked if she could take his word for it. The boy stammered and said yes. But only one phrase and thought echoed in his head. The thought that he would betray her after all. And in fact, she shouldn't have taken his word for it. These thoughts gave Arx no peace. He saw his friend's joyful face and felt a heaviness in his soul. It seemed to him that this twisting force was whispering this very thing to him. And then another day came. Arx and his friend, a guy about his age, fought with swords in the mansion's garden. Arx was wounded, but still asked to fight again. But his friend noticed that Arx was covered in wounds and did not want to continue the fight. The boy replied that he was fine. He waved his magic sword in the air and realized one important thing again. He had no time to rest. Arx was sure that he had 5 years left, maybe less. And by that time, he was determined to become the strongest. His magic sword cut sharply through the air. It was broad daylight outside. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and there was not a cloud in sight. The Ansiness mansion stood in the bright sunlight, its walls glowing beautifully and reflecting the light. The battles between Arx and his comrade were in full swing. But Arx was still wounded. His comrade asked him to take a break and leave the fighting with magic sword for now. Arx, standing opposite his comrade and barely holding his sword in his hands, was stunned. But he assured him that everything was fine and asked to fight a little longer. Arx's companion said that wasn't the case, and his gaze became slightly downcast. He said that as soon as he knocked Arx down, the lady's gaze became frightening. At that moment, Lady Eleanor came out of the mansion, dressed in a beautiful summer short dress with a fluffy skirt and mini lantern sleeves. Her hair was spectacularly blowing in the wind and was loose. She took a threatening and frightening stance. She stood up, spread her legs, and put her hands on her hips. She looked really unfriendly. She asked menacingly when they had managed to fight and injure each other. The boys looked at her and tensed up. Comrade Arx patted him lightly on the shoulder and said that since he understood everything, it was time for a break. Arx, leaning forward wearily and heavily, supporting his head, answered him in the affirmative. Arx headed toward her and said that the lady could have called out to him. But Eleanor smiled, fixed her hair, and replied that she didn't want to interfere with his efforts. Arx asked about Eleanor's lesson with Nanai. The girl replied that the lesson with the maid was already over. Eleanor looked him in the eyes with her kind, friendly gaze. She said that Arx could praise her or something. Arx was a little embarrassed and raised his eyebrows, widening his eyes. He replied that this was to be expected from Lady Eleanor, and he patted her head and hair in a friendly manner. The girl smiled sweetly and broadly at this gesture. Arx tried to make his tired, tormented face a little happier. And then Arx thought about the night after the reception. He realized that the reason for Eleanor's fall into darkness would be his death. That is, the death of her childhood friend. Arx did his best to prevent her from turning to darkness. The boy thought he had managed to escape the main plot, but, as it turned out, he hadn't changed anything. What a hopeless situation, Arx thought. If Arx died now, Eleanor would turn into a cruel villain, and, as befits the final boss, she would meet her tragic end. Arx wanted to avoid this at all costs. He thought about deliberately pushing her away so that she would hate him, but pushing her away now would be, in the boy's opinion, much worse. At that moment, Eleanor asked and begged him to stroke her hair and face more and more. The girl looked at him with such sweet, devoted, and kind eyes that he had never seen before. And Arx continued to stroke her. There was definitely a spark between them. And Arx himself did not want to die now. He was pleased that Lady Eleanor had become attached to him, and yet, he believed that there was only one way out. Become the strongest and survive. Deep down, Arx was very afraid and worried about his Eleanor. He was constantly anxious. At that moment, Eleanor noticed again that Arx was lost in thought, far away and deep in his own thoughts, and began to pierce him with her ominous gaze. She remarked aloud and said sternly that the boy had not been himself lately. And then he returned from his thoughts to reality and responded, moving his hands cheerfully and gesturing, to make it clear to Eleanor that he was with her here, nearby. He raised his eyebrows, widened his eyes, and instantly his fatigue evaporated, replaced by activity and cheerfulness. And in his head, he said a phrase to himself about how he would soon die, and because of this, Mrs. Eleanor would turn into a monster that tormented people. In his head, It sounded very funny and even sarcastic, which did not correspond to reality. And immediately Arx thought that he could never say such a thing. So, in reality, he replied that Eleanor should figure it out for herself. And then, suddenly, his friend, who was most likely working as a teacher for Arx, appeared behind him. He patted the boy on the shoulder and said that it was all because of the trial ritual. According to this guy, Arx wanted to show himself in the best light to the lady. He said this very cheerfully, with hope and enthusiasm. But Arx did not expect his friend to appear so suddenly and became visibly anxious. And then Eleanor understood what was going on. The comrade replied that yes, it was true. When Arx turned 10, he became very passionate, according to this guy. The comrade hugged him by the shoulders and pulled him close. Arx couldn't say anything and just remained silent. Eleanor suspected something was wrong. She noticed that Arx had no expression on his face and asked him if he was okay. The girl was very concerned about her friend's condition. Arx thought for a moment and stepped aside to immerse himself in his thoughts. He replied that he had just remembered something very urgent and apologized. Eleanor remained silent and couldn't say anything. She was a little confused and didn't understand what he was talking about. She looked at Arx with sad eyes, wanting to make him feel better. Arx thought this was very bad. He couldn't understand how he could have forgotten something so important. That's what had slipped his mind. He had forgotten about the most deadly event. It was a trial ritual, a ceremony in which 10-year-old children descend into the dungeon to test their skills and courage. Of course, safety is monitored there, but if something unexpected happens, it will happen there. Arx wanted to understand as soon as possible what he should do now. What did he need to do to survive? The boy searched for answers to these questions in his head, in his thoughts, in his reasoning. Day and night, he was tormented by such thoughts. He thought about it, and then realized that he must not die. It was a very confident and decisive thought. He studied. He learned courage, bravery, bold fighting, and confident sword skills. He studied books and spells, learning everything new to become the strongest. He locked himself in his room for days on end, poring over textbooks and carefully studying the material. He studied through pain and tears. His strength was unshakable, and his confidence and determination were clearly visible in his actions. He wanted to win the trial at any cost. And so, some time passed. The day before the trial arrived, Arx was once again sitting in his room with his books, delving into the essence of the knowledge he was acquiring. He threw his arms behind his head wearily and leaned back in his chair. He listed to himself all the poisonous creatures to be feared. The boy did everything in his power. But would he really die tomorrow? Arx didn't want that. He wanted to become the strongest for the sake of his beloved mistress, Eleanor. He looked up at the ceiling with a wistful and weary gaze. There was little hope in his eyes, but his confidence was very strong. If only he knew the reason for his impending death. Arx believes that this game is an impenetrable hell. How did Arx die? It was as if he was talking to himself in his head and in his thoughts. What kind of death could push Eleanor into darkness? He looked into the empty glass window and saw his reflection. His eyes were just as empty. After some time, Arx and Eleanor found themselves together again. They gathered in the forest for a test. The girl asked Arx if they just needed to walk to the thicket of the forest. Arx replied that yes, that was correct, and so they set off. The children walked along a forest path through trees and bushes. Eleanor walked very restlessly. She was scared and anxious. It was obvious from her face. Arx took her hand and asked her to calm down and not worry. He told Ms. Eleanor that he would protect her. They looked trustingly into each other's eyes. But the girl still felt uneasy. She turned to Arx and asked if he was scared. Arx remained silent. Only the thoughts in his head could describe his true state. To be honest, he was really scared. He admitted this to himself. He had been scared ever since he learned that he was going to die. And he began to speak aloud. The boy said in a kind, reassuring voice that it would be much scarier if Lady Eleanor were to suffer. She was surprised and a little embarrassed, her pupils dilating in surprise. But she looked very cute. Eleanor said that if something happened to them, she would rely on Arx. The girl looked at him and made it clear that she trusted him completely. She took him by the forearm and hid behind him. Arx was embarrassed and excited, not expecting this. He replied that they could continue on into the forest. And yes, everything was fine, he was ready. That's what he thought in his head. His face became calmer. He suddenly realized that all he could do was believe in himself. And he clenched his fist tightly. Arx gave his girlfriend the command to move on, and the guys headed straight into the depths of the forest. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.